The stomach receives food from the esophagus, and we talked about the gastroesophageal sphincter, which is partially made up of the diaphragm as the esophagus moves through the diaphragm, but it is actually called a physiological sphincter because there really is no enlargement of the smooth muscle that can actually close off that sphincter. So remember that food that is swallowed is a bolus. It moves down, and then eventually that peristaltic wave of contraction is going to force the gastroesophageal sphincter to open and then allow food and liquid to move into the stomach. So the stomach is very amazing because it has a variety of functions. One is that it can store food and liquid. So we have the storage of food and liquid. Like up to 2 liters, it can expand. And you might think of this as maybe not being such a good thing. But if you imagine not being able to eat a large meal and then use that energy for the rest of the day, that would be what would happen if you had a small stomach or if you've had your stomach reduced in size. So this allows us to not have to eat all of the time. So you could get all of your nutrients and energy, carbohydrates and proteins and vitamins and minerals in one meal during the day, rather than having to eat a lot small meals over time. Now, so in the past, or maybe even currently, actually, people who want to lose weight, they might have their stomach artificially reduced in size. So either stapled or like a band put around it to reduce it. Some of them even do a gastric bypass. So they bypass the stomach entirely. So the food would go around the stomach. So it cannot be stored in the stomach. And this would prevent you from eating huge amounts of food at one time. So when we look at the other function of the stomach is that it functions in mechanical breakdown or mechanical digestion. And this is because it is a big muscle. So we have churning that happens. Sometimes this happens on an empty stomach, and this is why your stomach growls. Even the smell of food or the sight of the food or even thinking about eating can sometimes cause your stomach to start to undergo peristalsis. So this churning, what this does is it mixes the food and the gastric juices. And when you mix those together, they actually create a slurry, which is referred to as the chyme. So chyme is the mixture of the food and the gastric juice. So let's look at the stomach as a big muscle. Here you can see its structure. Remember, it has fundamentally those 4 tunics or 4 layers of the alimentary canal. So it's lined with simple columnar epithelial tissue. It's a mucous membrane, the mucosa. And then it has the submucosa, but then it also has the external muscularis. So the stomach is the only part of your alimentary canal that actually has 3 layers of muscle. So we can talk about these 3 layers of smooth muscle. So remember that all of our systems, alimentary systems, have longitudinal and circular, but this oblique layer, which is where the fibers, the muscle fibers are running in that fashion, is extra. So an extra oblique layer. Okay. You'll also notice that there is folding. So the folding is called the rugae. So here we have these folds, these rugae, right? And they can allow the stomach to expand when we take in extra food or extra liquids. And then we have a very important part of the stomach, right here, which is a sphincter. So it's an enlargement of that smooth muscle. And sphincters allow for the one-way passage of food and digestive juices in from the stomach, in this particular instance, to the first part of your small intestine, which is your duodenum or duodenum. So let's look at the, oops, I ran out of room there. The stomach in the cadaver, this just shows its size, right? Tends to sit over onto the left side of your body, and that curvature is on the left. You might know this if you have chronic heartburn, and there is a way to lay that makes it less likely that the stomach acid is going to come into your esophagus. So for example, if you lay with the stomach curving down like on the left side of your body, is that right? Then it is less likely to move up the acid into your esophagus. Okay, so we can see that it is also highly vascularized. So there's lots of blood that go to the stomach, right, to help and aid in that contraction of the muscle. So let's look at this pyloric sphincter. So the pyloric sphincter separates the stomach from the small intestine. And I'm kind of, this is not a very good way to write on here, small intestine. And this first part of the small intestine is referred to as the duodenum. Now, it's really important that the sphincter doesn't just open up all at once and allow a dumping of gastric juices into your small intestine, because the small intestine actually does not want to be acidic. So the stomach is very acidic, but the small intestine actually has an alkaline, right, content to it. And the enzymes in the small intestine do not work properly under very acidic conditions. So what happens is it just opens up a little bit, and a little bit of chyme is squirted from your stomach into your small intestine at once, and then it closes back up. And so it's just like a squirt, wait, right? So that it can, that acidic chyme can actually be neutralized by pancreatic juices, which also enter into the duodenum. And we're going to talk about the pancreatic juices in a future video. So let's look at the gastric juice. What is it made of? We know that it is acidic. So the gastric juice includes hydrochloric acid. So this is hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid is secreted by cells within the gastric pit that are referred to as parietal cells. Hydrochloric acid is secreted by parietal cells. The other component of your gastric juice is pepsin. And pepsin, like peptide, think amino acids. This aids in the chemical digestion of proteins. So it aids in the chemical digestion of proteins. So these together are actually very good at breaking down protein like a steak. So if you take a big hunk of steak and you chew it up and then you swallow it, there's lots of connective tissue that needs to be broken down. And so the hydrochloric acid actually helps to break down that connective tissue so that the enzymes can begin to cleave the large protein molecules, so that when it gets into the small intestine, those amino acids can be further separated from the peptides, and then they can be absorbed into your circulatory system. So this gastric juice is really good for that. It's also really good for killing any microbes that might end up in your digestive tract from eating because of the hydrochloric acid. So it is a protective barrier. Okay, so it's a protective barrier. So if we look at the pepsin, it is secreted by what are called chief cells. Chief cells. So let's look at a gastric pit in your stomach. So these gastric pits are these invaginations in the mucosa, in the epithelial tissue. You'll notice that the epithelial tissue here is a single layer of column-shaped cells. The parietal cells are going to be secreting hydrochloric acid, making it an acidic environment. And then the chief cells down here are going to be secreting the pepsin in the form of a chemical called pepsinogen, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So this is my gastric gland, which sits within a gastric pit. This is another look at my gastric glands, right? Parietal cells secreting HCl, that intrinsic factor, we'll talk about that later. And then the chief cells secreting a form of pepsin, which is called pepsinogen. So the next thing we're going to talk about is how the stomach protects itself from self-digestion. So let's go to protecting the stomach from self-digestion. Oops. Protection against self-digestion. So if you think about it, we are actually walking around with the stomach, right? That's full of acids. And this acid would burn us if it was like, and sometimes it does burn if you like vomit it up, the stomach acid, right? How does the stomach itself, how is it protected? So the first part is this idea of the mucous membrane. So the stomach acid cannot break through the mucous membrane. So it is not going to actually damage the lining of the stomach. So the lining of the stomach, that mucous membrane is really important. And we have specific cells that produce mucus. They are called goblet cells. So they produce the mucus. We want mucus in our stomach to protect it from the acid. The other part is that we secrete pepsin in its inactive form. So we actually secrete it as pepsinogen. Anytime you see inogen, that means that it is inactive pepsinogen. Okay, so one of the interesting things is that pepsinogen is only converted to pepsin in the presence of hydrochloric acid. So we could write that chemical reaction where we have pepsinogen being secreted into the lumen of my stomach, and then it is converted to pepsin in the presence of hydrochloric acid. So this means that the pepsin does not have contact with the cells because it is protected, the membrane is protected by the mucus lining. Now, there are different things that can get through that mucus lining, which can lead to bleeding and damage to the mucous membrane. So we can talk about damage to the mucous membrane. This mucous membrane can be damaged by, say, for example, excessive salts. So salt, aspirin, alcohol. Those are some things that can damage the lining of the mucous membrane of your stomach. And so this can lead to gastric ulcers. So this is one source of bleeding in your digestive system. We also now know that there are a form of bacteria which are called H. pylori, Helicobacter pylori. This is bacteria that are pathogenic in the stomach. So bacteria that can damage the mucous membrane. So it used to be that if you went to the doctor with gastric ulcers, they would change your diet and they would say that you are too stressed out, and that is what is causing extra acid in your stomach. But recently they've discovered that it is the H. pylori in many cases that is causing this, and this is a bacterial infection. You can do a breath test to determine if you have H. pylori, and you can actually go on antibiotics. It's not a pleasant antibiotic series. It's a very long antibiotic series, but it will kill off the H. pylori so that you don't have gastric ulcers. And so it's important to realize that this could be a cause of gastric upset, right? And the bleeding of the stomach.